Welcome back to my channel. I'm Traben, and in today's video, we'll just be looking at a couple of my favorite authors. We're just talking about my favorite authors to give you a sense of like what are some of the things that I enjoy, so you know kind of my style of what gets 5 stars for me, what really excites me about reading. Recently, I've had a lot of like 3-star reviews, maybe 4-star reviews. Everything seems to be falling a little bit short. And so I wanted to take some time to talk about what are some of the best authors that I've read, some of the ones that are my favorites. I'm not going to be presenting them in any particular order. Let's go ahead and get into it. We'll start with Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett is a very famous, well-known English fantasy writer. His books are celebrated for adding in satire and humor into this fantasy world. The world that it takes place on is a flat disc that sits on the top of 4 elephants, and those elephants are riding on top of a great turtle that is flying through space. On that disc, you have all manner of crazy adventures going on, and the really nice thing about Pratchett's work is that there are a number of separate plot lines that you can go down if you're willing to do a little bit of reading ahead of time to find out what the different groupings of books are about. You can find something that really appeals to you. For me, I really like the City Watch series. So this is one of the ones from their Guards, and it follows the police force in Ankh-Morpork, where as they gradually gain members and try to solve crimes in this world that has all this crazy fantasy technology. Very inventive and fun, balancing the absurd and the surreal with very meaningful social and political commentary. If you want something that is humorous but also has a message, he's an excellent author to pick up. It might feel a little daunting to know where to start because there are so many books in the Discworld line. It can be hard to figure out where you should begin reading. Go online, find out some information, look up a bit about the different books, and find one that you think will work for you. Next up, I want to talk about Neil Gaiman. Gaiman writes very broadly. So he has fiction stories, he has fantasy, sci-fi, he has nonfiction. He writes across ages, across genres, but everything he writes has this quality behind it. You know when you pick up a Neil Gaiman book that it's going to be written very well, that the prose is going to be both poetic but also flow, that the stories will be wildly creative. And Gaiman is one who I think I have probably read the most broadly. Most of what I would consider his mainstream books I've read. I think the only exception might be Anasazi Boys, but I've read like Interworld, I've read his Norse mythology nonfiction book, I've read through like Coraline and Fortunately the Milk, and all the way up through his short story collections and American Gods, which is clearly not aimed at a younger audience. He tends not to do a lot of series, so they're one and done books, which is generally a plus for me. And Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett did a book together called Good Omens. Most people know about this. It had a HBO series, I think. This copy is actually personalized. I got this signed by Neil Gaiman. It's one of the only books that I've gotten personally signed and met the author. Another one to look at if you like the style of either author. Next up, we're going to talk about Jim Butcher, probably best known for the Dresden Files series, which is my favorite urban fantasy series of all time, and was the first piece of long-form fiction that I read that really felt like it had a strong handle on pacing a longer story. A lot of trilogies that I read, or a lot of book series that I read, especially in the fantasy genre, you tend to have a world-ending calamity even in book one, and the heroes stop that, and then you have to write a sequel. So, like, what do you do? And you get into this situation where every book is some sort of unforeseen, cataclysmic, world-shattering event. With the Dresden Files, it's a lot more slower going in building up the character to the point where you're getting to these like world-altering levels of conflict. At the very beginning, it's just about Dresden trying to defend his city from a rogue necromancer. And while he struggles with that, because he has not had a lot of experience in combat and a lot of experience in policing like he's trying to do, it maintains a feeling of being lower stakes than when you get to book 12 or book 13, where he's coming up against much more dire threats. Our main character, Dresden, has a lot more power, a lot more resources, a lot more support than he had at the start of the story. There are some complaints about this series in particular about the sexism. I feel like it is a character trait and not an author trait, as evidenced by his other work. I've not read Codex Alara from Jim Butcher, but I have read the first of his Cinder Spires. The Aeronaut's Windlass is the other one I've read. I know the sequel book is out finally. I do not like the covers, and I have not gotten around to picking it up yet. So, but that's another good series. So this is an author who primarily I've read a single thing from them, but it was so striking and so well done. And there is a lot of content. This is now, I think, 17 books long. So there's a lot to dive into and a lot to look at as far as the work, even with just a single title. To contrast rather sharply with what I was just saying about the Dresden Files, we have Erin Morgenstern, who, to my knowledge, has only written two major novels, The Night Circus and The Starless Sea, but both of them were so clever, so creative, and so beautifully written that I had to put her on my list. I feel like Night Circus is the better of the two. Starless Sea does hit more with the bibliophiles because it's a story about storytelling and it's got a lot of meta humor in it, but some of it didn't land for me. Night Circus, the magic in here, the descriptions, the romance. I've been pretty vocal about my frustrations with the YA titles always having this romance in them. This is a romantasy book, but I feel like it's done so well here. It's so well developed that it is something that's enjoyable to read. This is also the only book I can think of that has used second person effectively in a way that drew me into the story rather than as something that felt like a device, an odd choice just for trying to go against the grain and do something clever and weird. There are some second person narration between some of the events of the story where you are walking through the attractions of the circus. So these two characters are creating different attractions, or they're creating different exhibits that people are going and seeing, and having that second person narration where it's kind of like a choose your own adventure for a second and you are the one walking through it is actually a really effective way of drawing you into that moment. For that, I also feel like it's a very strong read. So despite only having these two books, she's proven that she's very strong and one of my favorite authors. We're going to change gears for a second and talk about a comic book. I review and look at comic books quite frequently, so it would feel odd not including someone in here from that sphere. And for that, I've chosen James Tynion IV. James Tynion IV writes Something is Killing the Children, along with the House of Slaughter offshoot. They're all part of the same universe. This series is my biggest touching point for James Tynion's work. However, he is very well known within the comic book community. He frequently is nominated or wins the Eisner Award each year for his work. In addition to Something is Killing the Children, I also read Nice House on the Lake last year. I started The Department of Truth, and everything that Tynion puts his name on is guaranteed to be something that is cerebral, something that will be a little esoteric, perhaps, like a little bit difficult to get into at first, but something that raises very interesting moral questions and does so through fully realized characters in situations that, despite how crazy the world around them is, they react in ways that feel very believable. Despite having these insane worlds, these weird setups for his stories, there's always a very human element at the core of it. Something is Killing the Children is one of my favorite ongoing comics at the moment. An excellent horror comic. So if you are looking for something with monsters and gore and questions about morality, is our job to kill the monsters or is our job to protect people? And while that is not a novel concept, that's not a new concept, the depth at which it's explored within this book is really fascinating. So I'd highly recommend taking a look at Something is Killing the Children if you're interested in getting a sense of what Tynion's work is like. Of course, we've got to talk about Brandon Sanderson. This is another author that I've read quite a few of his works. I've read through the Reckoner series. I've read through the first era of Mistborn. I've read through the Skyward series, and I've started up the Stormlight Archives. It's my plan to catch up this year and be current with that. I also read all the Secret Project books that he put out last year. Sanderson's work is always very easy to read. Sanderson is a college professor. He puts up, or he did put up, his lectures online, so you can go and look at them and get into his class basically and see the kinds of things that he teaches to his students. And one of the core elements of his philosophy is this idea that the author should basically become invisible. He gets hit for his prose occasionally about them being a little bit too simple, about them being a little too plain, but I feel like it's entirely intentional to deliver a story in a way that is digestible across a wide swath of age ranges or age groups. Having finished the Reckoner series, Skyward, and Mistborn, I do feel like he occasionally misses the mark on his conclusions, on his endings. I did not care for the end of the Reckoner series. It made me very upset for reasons that I would take too long to get into here. His conclusions are something that people point to as kind of a sticking point for him as well. The Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England, or whatever that title was called, was among several people's worst of list for 2023. And honestly, like, if that's on your worst list, I think you were having a pretty good year, but it wasn't very strong. And so any one of his works can be, varies in quality perhaps, but overall I feel like when I'm sitting down and reading a Sanderson book, it reads very quickly, it's always engaging, and he comes up with such interesting magic systems, and then layers on top of that the idea of the Cosmere for several of them. They're all taking place in the same universe. They're just on different worlds in that same universe, and so the magic works different for the different places, but there's still an overarching way that magic works for that universe. It's a very compelling system to sit down and ponder and think about as you're reading through it. His characters always have a little bit of some sort of quirk. that's supposed to make them engaging. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's another thing that might not work for some people. But Mistborn is among my favorite fantasy series of all time. It was such a strong trilogy. It suffered from the same thing that all trilogies do, especially the middle book, which has to both serve as like its own complete plot line and the rising action of the series overall. But I felt like it really did stick the landing. It really was great throughout and had some really shocking moments in it. So if I was going to recommend what should someone read if they were interested in picking up Brandon Sanderson, I would say start with Mistborn. Of course, we've got to talk about Eiichiro Oda. I have all 105 volumes that have been released stateside of this manga. We're going to roll a bunch of stuff that we've already talked about with other authors, the things I've enjoyed about them, into our discussion about Oda. So Oda, more than anyone else, has this ability to marry the absurd, crazy, goofy humor and outlandish situations and well thought out, deeply political discourse about the way the world works, like really heavy themes. So One Piece is, on one level, a goofy manga about pirates, a pirate who has stretchy powers and wants to be king of the pirates, and very standard shonen fare. On another level, it's about how the government is complicit in the suffering of their people because they allow the ultra rich to control the world, and their military is basically just a puppet for the rich to do whatever they want, to enslave people, to kill people. And so there are some really heavy themes in here, and that's like at the highest like macro level you can look at it. There's also just the moments where a character will stand up for a friend or will do something that they know is going to challenge them, they know is going to be scary, and in that moment, like, you're really rooting for that character. So much emotion in here as well, along with, you know, ridiculous giraffes that like scrunch their necks up so they can poke people really hard with their nose, and triceratopses that fly. It has this ability to balance those two factors better than anything else I've ever read. It is very lengthy, which I know is a big hurdle for a lot of people. So I understand that. Like, I'm not ignorant of how daunting a 105 plus manga series is going to be for someone. Also know that some people just can't get past the goofiness. That's not what they're looking for in their comics or in their reading. And this is another author that has largely just done the one title. There were a handful of things that have been collected in a series called Wanted that Oda did before he got his big break with One Piece. But ever since One Piece started gaining traction, that's all he's written. So it's another thing like with Butcher, where I'm really only familiar with the author from one series, but that series is so lengthy and has been developed over so many years that you can get a really strong sense of the author, even though they're only working on a single title. I hope you enjoyed this brief look at some of my favorite authors. Hopefully it gives you a sense of the kinds of things that I enjoy seeing in the books that I read. I enjoy the poetic prose. I enjoy the outlandish enmeshed with poignant theming. I enjoy slow character growth and like building a character over time, and you've got to stick the landing. To one degree or another, these authors have managed to create worlds or characters that really resonate with me. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me down in the comments, what are your favorite authors? What do you look for in a piece of fiction? What are the elements that excite you about the books that you read as you continue on your journey? And as always, I hope that reading journey is going well. Until the next one, take care.